Chapter 15 of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Valley of the Sacrifice. For the first half hour of their climb down into the Valley of the Scratch, the three friends were too preoccupied with their own safety to talk more than an occasional sentence. They came upon many places that at first glance appeared impassable, or at least sufficiently hazardous to cause them to hesitate, but in each instant the changing contour of the precipice offered some other means of descent. After 30 minutes of arduous effort, the Big Business Man sat down suddenly upon a rock and began to unlace his shoes. "I've got to rest a while," he groaned. "My feet are in terrible shape." His two companions were glad of the opportunity to sit with him for a moment. "Gosh, I'm all in too," said the Very Young Man with a sigh. They were sitting upon a ledge about 20 feet wide, with the wall down which they had come at their back. "I'll swear that's as far down there as it ever was," said the Big Business Man, with a wave of his hand towards the valley below them. "Further," remarked the Very Young Man, "I've known that right along." "That's to be expected," said the Doctor. "But we're a third of the way down, just the same. That's the main thing." He glanced up the rocky, precipitous wall behind them. "We've come down 1,000 feet at least. The valley must be 3,000 feet deep or more now." "Say, how deep does it get before it stops?" inquired the Very Young Man. The Doctor smiled at him quietly. Roger's note put it about 12,000, he answered. "It should reach that depth and stop about—" He hesitated a moment, calculating. "About 2 o'clock," he finished. "Some climb," commented the Very Young Man. "We could do this a lot better than we're doing it, I think." For some time they sat in silence. From where they sat, the valley had all the appearance of a rocky, barren cañon of their own world above, as it might have looked on the late afternoon of a cloudless summer day. A gentle breeze was blowing, and in the sky overhead they could still see the huge light that for them was the sun. "The weather's certainly great down here, anyway," observed the Very Young Man. "That's one consolation." The Big Business Man had replaced his shoes, taken a swallow of water, and risen to his feet, preparing to start downward again, when suddenly they all noticed a curious swaying motion, as though the earth were moving under them. "Now what?" ejaculated the Very Young Man, standing up abruptly with his feet spread wide apart. The ground seemed pressing against his feet, as if he were weighed down with a heavy load, and he felt a little also as though in a moving train with a side thrust to guard against. The sun was no longer visible, and the valley was plunged in the semi-darkness of twilight. A strong wind sprang up, sweeping down upon them from above. The Very Young Man and the Big Business Man looked puzzled. The Doctor alone of the three seemed to understand what was happening. "He's moving the ring," he explained, with a note of apprehension in his voice. "Oh!" ejaculated the Big Business Man, comprehending at last. "So that's the—" The Very Young Man, standing with his back to the wall and his legs spread wide, looked hastily at his watch. "Moving the ring? Why, damn it," he began impetuously. The Big Business Man interrupted him. "Look there, look!" he almost whispered, awestruck. The sky above the valley suddenly had become suffused with red. As they watched, it seemed to take form, appearing no longer space, but filled with some enormous body of reddish color. In one place they could see it broken into a line of gray, and underneath the gray two circular holes of light gleamed down at them. The Doctor shuddered and closed his eyes. His two friends stared upward, fascinated into immobility. "What is that?" the Very Young Man whispered. Before he could be answered, the earth swayed under them more violently than before. The red faded back out of the sky, and the sun appeared sweeping up into the zenith, where it hung swaying a moment, and then poised motionless. The valley was flooded again with light, the ground steadied under them and became quiet. The wind died rapidly away, and in another moment it was as though nothing unusual had occurred. For a time the three friends stood silent, too astonished for words at this extraordinary experience. The Doctor was the first to recover himself. "He moved the ring," he said hurriedly. "That's twice. We must hurry." "It's only 10:15. We told him not till 11," protested the Very Young Man. "Even that is too soon for safety," said the Doctor back over his shoulder, for already he had started downward. It was nearly 12 o'clock when they stopped again for a rest. At this time the valley appeared about 7,000 or 8,000 feet deep. They estimated themselves to be slightly more than halfway down. From 11 until 12 they had momentarily expected some disturbing phenomena attendant upon the removal of the ring by the Banker from the club room to its place in the museum, but nothing unusual had occurred. "He probably decided to leave it alone for a while," commented the Big Business Man as they were discussing the matter. "Glad he showed that much sense." "It would not bother us much now," the Doctor replied. "We're too far down. See how the light is changing." The sky showed now only a narrow ribbon of blue between the edges of the cañon walls. The sun was behind the wall down which they were climbing, out of sight and throwing their side of the valley into shadow. Already they could begin to see a dim phosphorescence glowing from the rocks near at hand. The Very Young Man, sitting beside the Doctor, suddenly gripped his friend by the arm. "A bird," he said, pointing down the valley. "See it there." From far off they could see a bird coming up the center of the valley at a height apparently almost level with their own position, and flying towards them. They watched it in silence as it rapidly approached. "Great Scott, it's big!" muttered the Big Business Man in an undertone. As the bird came closer they saw it was fully 50 feet across the wings. It was flying straight down the valley at tremendous speed. When it was nearly opposite them they heard a familiar cheep, cheep come echoing across the valley. "The sparrow," whispered the Very Young Man. "Oh, my gosh, look how big it is!" In another moment it had passed them. They watched in silence until it disappeared in the distance. "Well," said the Very Young Man, "if that had ever seen us—" He drew a long breath, leaving the rest to the imagination of his hearers. "What a wonderful thing," said the Big Business Man, with a note of awe in his voice. "Just think, that sparrow, when we last saw it, was infinitesimally small." The Doctor laughed. "It's far smaller now than it was then," he said. "Only since we last saw it we have changed size to a much greater extent than it has." "Foolish of us to have sent it in here," remarked the Big Business Man casually. "Suppose that—" He stopped abruptly. The Very Young Man started hastily to his feet. "Oh, golly!" he exclaimed, as the same thought occurred to him. "That lizard!" He looked about him wildly. "It was foolish, perhaps," the Doctor spoke quietly, "but we can't help it now. The sparrow has gone. The lizard may be right here at our feet." The Very Young Man jumped involuntarily. "And so small we can't see it," the Doctor finished with a smile. "Or it may be 100 miles away, as big as a dinosaur." The Very Young Man shuddered. "It was senseless of us to let them get in here, anyway," said the Big Business Man. "That sparrow evidently has stopped getting smaller. Do you realize how big it will be to us after we've diminished a few hundred times more?" "We needn't worry over it," said the Doctor. "Even if we knew the lizard got into the valley, the chances of our seeing it here are 1 in a million. But we don't even know that. If you'll remember, it was still some distance away from the scratch when it became invisible. I doubt very much if it even got there. No, I think probably we'll never see it again." "I hope not," declared the Very Young Man emphatically. For another hour they climbed steadily downward, making more rapid progress than before, for the descent became constantly less difficult. During this time they spoke little, but it was evident that the Very Young Man, from the frequent glances he threw around, never for a moment forgot the possibility of encountering the lizard. The sparrow did not return, although for that, too, they were constantly on the lookout. It was nearly half past one when the Big Business Man threw himself upon the ground, exhausted. The valley at this time had reached a depth of over 10,000 feet. It was still growing deeper, but the travelers had made good progress, and were not more than 1,500 feet above its bottom. They had been under tremendous physical exertion for over 5 hours, too absorbed in their strange experience to think of eating, and now all three agreed it was foolish to attempt to travel farther without food and rest. "We had better wait here an hour or two," the Doctor decided. "Our size will soon remain constant, and it won't take us long to get down after we've rested." "I'm hungry," suggested the Very Young Man. "How about you?" They ate and drank sparingly of the little store they had brought with them. The Doctor would not let them have much, both because he wanted to conserve their supply, and because he knew in their exhausted condition it would be bad for them to eat heartily. It was about 2 o'clock when they noticed that objects around them no longer were increasing in size. They had finished their meal and felt greatly refreshed. "Things have stopped growing," observed the Very Young Man. "We've done 4 pills worth of the journey now," he added facetiously. He rose to his feet, stretching. He felt sore and bruised all over, but with the meal and a little rest, not particularly tired. "I move we go on down now," he suggested, walking to the edge of the huge crevice in which they were sitting. "It's only a couple of thousand feet." "Perhaps we might as well," agreed the Doctor, rising also. "When we get to the floor of the valley we can find a good spot and turn in for the night." The incongruity of his last words with the scene around made the Doctor smile. Overhead the sky still showed a narrow ribbon of blue. Across the valley the sunlight sparkled on the yellowish crags of the rocky wall. In the shadow, on the side down which they were climbing, the rocks now shone distinctly phosphorescent, with a peculiar waviness of outline. "Not much like either day or night, is it?" added the Doctor. "We'll have to get used to that." They started off again, and in another 2 hours found themselves going down a gentle rocky slope and out upon the floor of the valley. "We're here at last," said the Big Business Man wearily. The Very Young Man looked up the great jagged precipice down which they had come, to where, far above, its edge against the strip of blue marked the surface of the ring. "Some trip," he remarked. "I wouldn't want to tackle that every day." "4 o'clock," said the Doctor. "The light up there looks just the same. I wonder what's happened to George." Neither of his companions answered him. The Big Business Man lay stretched full length upon the ground near by, and the Very Young Man still stood looking up the precipice, lost in thought. "What a nice climb going back," he suddenly remarked. The Doctor laughed. "Don't let's worry about that, Jack. If you remember how Rogers described it, getting back is easier than getting in. But the main point now," he added seriously, "is for us to make sure of getting down to Arite as speedily as possible." The Very Young Man surveyed the barren waste around them in dismay. The floor of the valley was strewn with even larger rocks and boulders than those on the surface above, and looked utterly pathless and desolate. "What do we do first?" he asked dubiously. "First," said the Doctor, smiling at the Big Business Man, who lay upon his back staring up into the sky and paying no attention to them whatever, "I think first we had better settle ourselves for a good long rest here." "If we stop at all, let's sleep a while," said the Very Young Man. "A little rest only gets you stiff." It's a pretty exposed place out here, though, isn't it, to sleep?" he added, thinking of the sparrow and the lizard. "One of us will stay awake and watch," answered the Doctor. End of chapter 15. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pit of Darkness. At the suggestion of the Very Young Man, they located without much difficulty a sort of cave amid the rocks, which offered shelter for their rest. Taking turns watching, they passed 8 hours in fair comfort, and by noon next day, after another frugal meal, they felt thoroughly refreshed and eager to continue the journey. "We are sure doing this classy," observed the Very Young Man. "Think of Rogers. All he could do was fall asleep when he couldn't stay awake any more. Gosh, what chances he took!" "We're playing it safe," agreed the Big Business Man. "But we mustn't take it too easy," added the Doctor. The Very Young Man stretched himself luxuriously and buckled his belt on tighter. "Well, I'm ready for anything," he announced. "What's next?" The Doctor consulted his papers. "We find the circular pit Rogers made in the scratch, and we descend into it. We take 12 more pills at the edge of the pit," he said. The Very Young Man leaped to the top of a rock and looked out over the desolate waste helplessly. "How are we going to find the pit?" he asked dubiously. "It's not in sight, that's sure." "It's down there about 5 miles," said the Doctor. "I saw it yesterday as we came down." "That's easy," said the Very Young Man, and he started off enthusiastically, followed by the others. In less than 2 hours they found themselves at the edge of the pit. It appeared almost circular in form, apparently about 5 miles across, and its smooth shining walls extended almost perpendicularly down into blackness. Somewhat awed by the task confronting them in getting down into this abyss, the three friends sat down near its brink to discuss their plan of action. "We take 12 pills here," said the Doctor. "That ought to make us small enough to climb down into that." "Do you think we need so many?" asked the Big Business Man thoughtfully. "You know, Frank, we're making an awful lot of work for ourselves, playing this thing so absolutely safe. Think of what a distance down that will be after we have got as small as 12 pills will make us. It might take us days to get to the bottom." "How did Rogers get down?" the Very Young Man wanted to know. "He took 12 pills here," the Doctor answered. "But as I understand it, he fell most of the way down while he was still big, and then got small afterwards at the bottom." This from the Big Business Man. "I don't know about you," said the Very Young Man dryly, "but I'd much rather take 3 days to walk down than fall down in 1 day." The Doctor smiled. "I still think," he said, "that we had better stick to the directions Rogers left us. Then at least there is no danger of our getting lost in size. But I agree with you, Jack. I'd rather not fall down, even if it takes longer to walk." "I wonder," began the Big Business Man. "You know, I've been thinking. It does seem an awful waste of energy for us to let ourselves get smaller than absolutely necessary in climbing down these places. Maybe you don't realize it." "I do," said the Very Young Man, looking sorrowfully at the ragged shoes on his feet and the cuts and bruises on his legs. "What I mean is," persisted the Big Business Man, "how far do you suppose we have actually traveled since we started last night?" "That's pretty hard to estimate," said the Doctor. "We have walked perhaps 15 miles altogether, besides the climb down. I suppose we actually came down 5,000 or 6,000 feet." "And at the size we are now, it would have been 12,000 feet down, wouldn't it?" "Yes," answered the Doctor, "it would." "And just think," went on the Big Business Man, "right now, based on the size we were when we began, we've only gone some 6 feet altogether from the place we started." "And a 1/16 of an inch or less since we left the surface of the ring," said the Doctor, smiling. "Gee, that's a weird thought," the Very Young Man said, as he gazed in awe at the lofty heights about them. "I've been thinking," continued the Big Business Man. "You say we must be careful not to get lost in size. Well, suppose instead of taking 12 pills here, we only take 6. That should be enough to get us started, possibly enough to get us all the way down. Then, before we moved at all, we could take the other 6. That would keep it straight, wouldn't it?" "Great idea," said the Very Young Man. "I'm in favor of that." "It sounds feasible. Certainly, if we can get all the way down with 6 pills, we will save a lot of climbing." "If 6 aren't enough, we can easily take more," added the Big Business Man. And so they decided to take only 6 pills of the drug, and to get down to the bottom of the pit, if possible, without taking more. The pit, as they stood looking down into it now, seemed quite impossible of descent, for its almost perpendicular wall was smooth and shining as polished brass. They took the drug standing close together at the edge of the pit. Immediately began again the same crawling sensation underfoot, much more rapid this time, while all around them the rocks began very rapidly increasing in size. The pit now seemed widening out at an astounding rate. In a few minutes it had broadened so that its opposite side could not be seen. The wall at the brink of which they stood had before curved in a great sweeping arc to enclose the circular hole. Now it stretched in a nearly straight, unbroken line to the right and left as far as they could see. Beneath them lay only blackness. It was as though they were at the edge of the world. "Good God, what a place to go down into!" gasped the Big Business Man, after they had been standing nearly half an hour in silence, appalled at the tremendous changes taking place around them. For some time past the wall before them had become sufficiently indented and broken to make possible their descent. It was the Doctor who first realized the time, or perhaps should it be said the size, they were losing by their inactivity, and with a few crisp words he brought them to themselves. They immediately started downward. For another 6 hours they traveled downward steadily, stopping only once to eat. The descent during this time was not unlike that down the side of the valley, although towards the last it began rapidly to grow less precipitous. They now found themselves confronted frequently with gentle slopes downward, half a mile or more in extent, and sometimes by almost level places, succeeded by another sharp descent. During this part of the trip they made more rapid progress than at any time since starting. The Very Young Man, in his enthusiasm, at times running forward, and then sitting down to wait for the others to overtake him. The light overhead gradually faded into the characteristic luminous blackness the Chemist had described. As it did so, the phosphorescent quality of the rocks greatly increased, or at least became more noticeable, so that the light illuminating the landscape became hardly less in volume, although totally different in quality. The ground underfoot and the rocks themselves had been steadily changing. They had lost now almost entirely the yellowishness, metal look, and seemed to have more the quality of a gray, opaque glass or marble. They appeared rather smoother, too, than before, although the huge boulders and loosely strewn rocks and pebbles still remained the characteristic feature of the landscape. The three men were still diminishing in size. In fact, at this time, the last dose of the drug seemed to have attained its maximum power, for objects around them appeared to be growing larger at a dizzying rate. They were getting used to this effect, however, to a great extent, and were no longer confused by the change as they had been before. It was the Big Business Man who first showed signs of weakening, and at the end of 6 hours or more of steady, and toward the end, extremely rapid traveling, he finally threw himself down and declared he could go no farther. At this point they rested again several hours, taking turns at watch, and each of them getting some measure of sleep. Of the three, the Very Young Man appeared in the best condition, although possibly it was his enthusiasm that kept him from admitting even to himself any serious physical distress. It was perhaps 10 or 12 hours after they had taken the 6 pills that they were again ready to start downward. Before starting, the three adventurers discussed earnestly the advisability of taking the other 6 pills. The action of the drug had ceased some time before. They decided not to, since apparently there was no difficulty facing them at this part of the journey, and decreasing their stature would only immeasurably lengthen the distance they had to go. They had been traveling downward through a barren land that now showed little change of aspect, for hardly more than another hour, when suddenly, without warning, they came upon the tremendous glossy incline that they had been expecting to reach for some time. The rocks and boulders stopped abruptly, and they found at their feet, sloping downward at an angle of nearly 45 degrees, a great smooth plain. It extended as far as they could see, both to the right and left and downward, at a slightly lessening angle, into the luminous darkness that now bounded their entire range of vision in every direction. This plain seemed distinctly of a different substance than anything they had hitherto encountered. It was, as the Chemist had described it, apparently like a smooth black marble. Yet it was not so smooth to them now as he had pictured it, for its surface was sufficiently indented and ridged to afford foothold. They started down this plain gingerly, yet with an assumed boldness they were all of them far from feeling. It was slow work at first, and occasionally one or the other of them would slide headlong a score of feet, until a break in the smoothness brought him to a stop. Their rubber-soled shoes stood them in good stead here, for without the aid given by them this part of the journey would have been impossible. For several hours they continued this form of descent. The incline grew constantly less steep, until finally they were able to walk down it quite comfortably. They stopped again to eat, and after traveling what seemed to them some 15 miles from the top of the incline, they finally reached its bottom. They seemed now to be upon a level floor, a ground of somewhat metallic quality, such as they had become familiar with above. Only now there were no rocks or boulders, and the ground was smoother and with a peculiar corrugation. On one side lay the incline down which they had come. There was nothing but darkness to be seen in any other direction. Here they stopped again to rest and recuperate, and then they discussed earnestly their next movements. The Doctor, seated wearily upon the ground, consulted his memoranda earnestly. The Very Young Man sat close beside him. As usual, the Big Business Man lay prone upon his back near by, waiting for their decision. "Rogers wasn't far from a forest when he got here," said the Very Young Man, looking sideways at the papers in the Doctor's hand. "And he speaks of a tiny range of hills, but we can't see anything from here." "We may not be within many miles of where Rogers landed," answered the Doctor. "No reason why we should be, at that, is there? Do you think we'll ever find Arite?" "Don't overlook the fact that we've got 6 more pills to take here," called the Big Business Man. "That's just what I was considering," said the Doctor thoughtfully. "There's no use our doing anything until we have attained the right size. Those hills and forest and river we are looking for might be here right at our feet, and we couldn't see them while we are as big as this." "We'd better take the pills and stay right here until their action wears off. I'm going to take a sleep," said the Big Business Man. "I think we might as well all sleep," said the Doctor. "There could not possibly be anything here to harm us." They each took the 6 additional pills without further words. Physically exhausted as they were, and with the artificial drowsiness produced by the drug, they were all three in a few moments fast asleep. End of chapter 16. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Welcome of the Master. It was nearly 12 hours later, as their watches showed them, that the first of the weary adventurers awoke. The Very Young Man it was who first opened his eyes with a confused sense of feeling that he was in bed at home, and that this was the momentous day he was to start his journey into the ring. He sat up and rubbed his eyes vigorously to see more clearly his surroundings. Beside him lay his 2 friends fast asleep. With returning consciousness came the memory of the events of the day and night before. The Very Young Man sprang to his feet and vigorously awoke his companions. The action of the drug again had ceased, and at first glance the scene seemed to have changed very little. The incline was now some distance away, although still visible, stretching up in a great arc and fading away into the blackness above. The ground beneath their feet, still of its metallic quality, appeared far rougher than before. The Very Young Man bent down and put his hand upon it. There was some form of vegetation there, and leaning closer he could see what appeared to be the ruins of a tiny forest, bent and trampled, the tree trunks no larger than slender twigs that he could have snapped asunder easily between his fingers. "Look at this!" he exclaimed. "The woods! We're here!" The others knelt down with him. "Be careful," cautioned the Doctor. "Don't move around. We must get smaller." He drew the papers from his pocket. Rogers was in doubt about the quantity to take. He added, "We should be now somewhere at the edge or in the forest he mentions. Yet we may be very far from the point at which he reached the bottom of that incline. I think, too, that we are somewhat larger than he was. Probably the strength of our drug differs from his to some extent." "How much should we take next, I wonder?" said the Big Business Man as he looked at his companions. The Doctor took a pill and crushed it in his hand. "Let us take so much," he said, indicating a small portion of the powder. The others each crushed one of the pills and endeavored to take as nearly as possible an equal amount. "I'm hungry," said the Very Young Man. "Can we eat right after the powder?" "I don't think that should make any difference," the Doctor answered, and so accustomed to the drug that they were now that, quite nonchalantly, they sat down and ate. After a few moments it became evident that in spite of their care the amount of drugs they had taken were far from equal. Before they had half finished eating, the Very Young Man was hardly more than a third the size of the Doctor, with the Big Business Man about halfway between. This predicament suddenly struck them as funny, and all three laughed heartily at the effect of the drug. "Hey, you hurry up, or you'll never catch me!" shouted the Very Young Man gleefully. "Gosh, but you're big!" He reached up and tried to touch the Doctor's shoulder. Then, seeing the huge piece of chocolate in his friend's hand, and comparing it with the little one in his own, he added, "Trade you chocolate. That's a regular meal you've got there." "That's a real idea," said the Big Business Man, ceasing his laughter abruptly. "Do you know, if we ever get really low on food, all we have to do is one of us stay big, and his food would last the other two a month." "Fine. But how about the big one?" asked the Very Young Man, grinning. "He'd starve to death on that plan, wouldn't he?" "Well, then he could get much smaller than the other two, and they could feed him. It's rather involved, I'll admit, but you know what I mean." The Big Business Man finished somewhat lamely. "I've got a much better scheme than that," said the Very Young Man. "You let the food stay large and you get small. How about that?" he added triumphantly. Then he laid carefully on the ground beside him a bit of chocolate and a few of the hard crackers they were eating. "Stay there, little friends. When you grow up I'll take you back," he added in a gleeful tone of voice. "Strange that should never have occurred to us," said the Doctor. "It's a perfect way of replenishing our food supply," and quite seriously both he and the Big Business Man laid aside some of their food. "Thank me for the brilliant idea," said the Very Young Man. Then, as another thought occurred to him, he scratched his head lugubriously. "Wouldn't work very well if we were getting bigger, would it? Don't let's ever get separated from any food coming out." The Doctor was gigantic now in proportion to the other two, and both he and the Big Business Man took a very small quantity more of the drug in an effort to equalize their rate of bodily reduction. They evidently hit it about right, for no further change in their relative size occurred. All this time the vegetation underneath them had been growing steadily larger. From tiny broken twigs it grew to sticks bigger than their fingers, then to the thickness of their arms. They moved slightly from time to time, letting it spread out from under them, or brushing it aside and clearing a space in which they could sit more comfortably. Still larger it grew, until the tree trunks, thick now almost as their bodies, were lying broken and twisted all about them. Over to one side they could see, half a mile away, a place where the trees were still standing, slender saplings they seemed, growing densely together. In half an hour more, the Very Young Man announced, he had stopped getting smaller. The action of the drug ceased in the others a few minutes later. They were still not quite in their relative sizes, but a few grains of the powder quickly adjusted that. They now found themselves near the edge of what once was a great forest. Huge trees, whose trunks measured 6 feet or more in diameter, lay scattered about upon the ground. Not a single one was left standing. In the distance they could see, some miles away, where the untrodden forest began. They had replaced the food in their belts some time before, and now again they were ready to start. Suddenly the Very Young Man spied a huge, round, whitish brown object lying beside a tree trunk near by. He went over and stood beside it. Then he called his friends excitedly. It was irregularly spherical in shape and stood higher than his knees, a great jagged ball. The Very Young Man bent down, broke off a piece of the ball, and, stuffing it into his mouth, began chewing with enthusiasm. "Now what do you think of that?" he remarked with a grin. "A cracker crumb I must have dropped when we first began lunch." They decided now to make for the nearest part of the unbroken forest. It was 2 hours before they reached it, for among the tangled mass of broken fallen trees their progress was extremely difficult and slow. Once inside among the standing trees they felt more lost than ever. They had followed implicitly the Chemist's directions, and in general had encountered the sort of country they expected. Nevertheless, they all three realized that it was probable the route they had followed coming in was quite different from that taken by the Chemist, and in what direction lay their destination, and how far, they had not even the vaguest idea, but they were determined to go on. "If we ever find this city of Arite it will be a miracle, sure," the Very Young Man remarked, as they were walking along in silence. They had gone only a short distance farther when the Big Business Man, who was walking in front, stopped abruptly. "What's that?" he asked in a startled undertone. They followed the direction of his hand, and saw standing rigid against a tree trunk ahead the figure of a man little more than half as tall as themselves, his grayish body very nearly the color of the blue gray tree behind him. The three adventurers stood motionless, staring in amazement. As the Big Business Man spoke, the little figure, which had evidently been watching them for some time, turned irresolutely as though about to run. Then, with gathering courage, it began walking slowly towards them, holding out its arms with the palms up. "He's friendly," whispered the Very Young Man, and they waited, silent, as the man approached. As he came closer they could see he was hardly more than a boy, perhaps 20 years of age. His lean gray body was nearly naked. Around his waist he wore a drab-colored tunic of a substance they could not identify. His feet and legs were bare. On his chest were strapped a thin stone plate, slightly convex. His thick, wavy black hair, cut at the base of his neck, hung close about his ears. His head was uncovered. His features were regular and pleasing. His smile showed an even row of very white teeth. The three men did not speak or move until in a moment more he stood directly before them, still holding out his hands, palm up. Then abruptly he spoke. "The Master welcomes his friends," he said in a soft, musical voice. He gave the words a most curious accent and inflection, yet they were quite understandable to his listeners. "The Master welcomes his friends," he repeated, dropping his arms to his sides and smiling in a most friendly manner. The Very Young Man caught his breath. "He's been sent to meet us. He's from Rogers. What do you think of that? We're all right now," he exclaimed excitedly. The Doctor held out his hand, and the ooid, hesitating a moment in doubt, finally reached up and grasped it. "Are you from Rogers?" asked the Doctor. The ooid looked puzzled. Then he turned and flung out his arms in a sweeping gesture towards the deeper woods before them. "Rogers, Master," he said. "You were waiting for us," persisted the Doctor, but the other only shook his head and smiled his lack of comprehension. "He only knows the first words he said," the Big Business Man suggested. "He must be from Rogers," the Very Young Man put in. "See, he wants us to go with him." The ooid was motioning them forward, holding out his hand as though to lead them. The Very Young Man started forward, but the Big Business Man held him back. "Wait a moment," he said. "I don't think we ought to go among these people as large as we are. Rogers is evidently alive and waiting for us. Why wouldn't it be better to be about his size instead of 10-foot giants as we would look now?" "How do you know how big Rogers is?" asked the Very Young Man. "I think that's a good idea," agreed the Doctor. "Roger described these ooid men as being some 6 inches shorter than himself on the average." "This one might be a pygmy for all we know," said the Very Young Man. "We might chance it that he's of normal size," said the Doctor, smiling. "I think we should make ourselves smaller." The ooid stood patiently by and watched them with interested eyes as each took a tiny pellet from a vial under his arm and touched it to his tongue. When they began to decrease in size, his eyes widened with fright and his legs shook under him. But he stood his ground, evidently assured by their smiles and friendly gestures. In a few minutes the action of the drug was over, and they found themselves not more than a head taller than the ooid. In this size he seemed to like them better, or at least he stood in far less awe of them, for now he seized them by the arms and pulled them forward vigorously. They laughingly yielded, and, led by this strange being from another world, they turned from the open places they had been following and plunged into the depths of the forest. End of chapter 17. The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Chemist and His Son. For an hour or more the three adventurers followed their strange guide in silence through the dense, trackless woods. He walked very rapidly, looking neither to the right nor to the left, finding his way apparently by an intuitive sense of direction. Occasionally he glanced back over his shoulder and smiled. Walking through the woods here was not difficult, and the party made rapid progress. The huge, upstanding tree trunks were devoid of limbs for 100 feet or more above the ground. On some of them a luxuriant vine was growing, a vine that bore a profusion of little gray berries. In the branches high overhead a few birds flew to and fro, calling out at times with a soft, cooing note. The ground, a gray, finely powdered, sandy loam, was carpeted with bluish fallen leaves, sometimes with a species of blue moss, and occasional ferns of a like color. The forest was dense, deep, and silent. The tree branches overhead locked together in a solid canopy, shutting out the black sky above. Yet, even in this seclusion, the scene remained as light as it had been outside the woods in the open. Darkness, indeed, was impossible in this land. Under all circumstances the light seemed the same, neither too bright nor too dim, a comfortable, steady glow, restful, almost hypnotic in its sameness. They had traveled perhaps 6 miles from the point where they met their Oroid guide, when suddenly the Very Young Man became aware that other Oroids were with them. Looking to one side, he saw 2 more of these strange gray men silently stalking along, keeping pace with them. Turning, he made out still another, following a short distance behind. The Very Young Man was startled, and hurriedly pointed them out to his companions. "Wait!" called the Doctor to their youthful guide, and abruptly the party came to a halt. By these signs they made their guide understand that they wanted these other men to come closer. The Oroid shouted to them, in his own quaint tongue, words of a soft, liquid quality with a wistful sound, words wholly unintelligible to the adventurers. The men came forward diffidently, 6 of them, for 3 others appeared out of the shadows of the forest and stood in a group, talking among themselves a little and smiling at their visitors. They were all dressed similarly to Lao, for such was the young Oroid's name, and all of them older than he, and of nearly the same height. "Do any of you speak English?" asked the Doctor, addressing them directly. Evidently they did not, for they answered only by shaking their heads and by more smiles. Then one of them spoke. "The Master welcomes his friends," he said, and all the others repeated it after him, like children in school repeating proudly a lesson newly learned. The Doctor and his 2 friends laughed heartily, and completely reassured by this exhibition of their friendliness, they signified to Lao that they were ready again to go forward. As they walked onward through the apparently endless and unchanging forest, surrounded by what the Very Young Man called their guard of honor, they were joined from time to time by other Oroid men, all of whom seemed to know who they were and where they were going, and who fell silently into line with them. Within an hour their party numbered 20 or more. Seeing one of the natives stop a moment and snatch some berries from one of the vines with which many of the trees were encumbered, the Very Young Man did the same. He found the berries sweet and palatable, and he ate a quantity. Then, discovering he was hungry, he took some crackers from his belt and ate them walking along. The Doctor and the Big Business Man ate also, for although they had not realized it, all 3 were actually famished. Shortly after this the party came to a broad, smooth flowing river, its banks lined with rushes, and here and there a little spot of gray, sandy beach. It was apparent from Lao's sign that they must wait at this point for a boat to take them across. This they were glad enough to do, for all three had gone nearly to the limit of their strength. They drank deep of the pure river water, laved their aching limbs in it gratefully, and lay down, caring not a bit how long they were forced to wait. In perhaps another hour the boat appeared. It came from down the river, propelled close inshore by two members of their own party who had gone to fetch it. At first the travelers thought it a long, oblong raft. Then, as it came closer, they could see it was constructed of three canoes, each about 30 feet long, hollowed out of tree trunks. Over these was laid a platform of small trees hewn roughly into boards. The boat was propelled by long, slender poles in the hands of two men who, one on each side, dug them into the bed of the river and walked with them the length of the platform. Onto this boat the entire party crowded, and they were soon well out on the shallow river, headed for its opposite bank. The Very Young Man, seated at the front end of the platform, with his legs dangling over and his feet only a few inches above the silver phosphorescence of the rippling water underneath, sighed luxuriously. "This beats anything we've done yet," he murmured. "Gee, it's nice here." When they landed on the farther bank another group of natives was waiting for them. The party, thus strengthened to nearly 40, started off immediately into the forest, which on this side of the river appeared equally dense and trackless. They appeared now to be paralleling the course of the river a few hundred yards back from its bank. After half an hour of this traveling they came abruptly to what at first appeared to be the mouth of a large cave, but which afterwards proved to be a tunnel-like passageway. Into this opening the party unhesitatingly plunged. Within this tunnel, which sloped downward at a considerable angle, they made even more rapid progress than in the forest above. The tunnel walls here were perhaps 20 feet apart, walls of glistening, radiant, crystalline rock. The roof of the passageway was fully twice as high as its width. Its rocky floor was smooth and even. After a time this tunnel was crossed by another, somewhat broader and higher, but in general of similar aspect. It too sloped downward more abruptly from the intersection. Into this latter passageway the party turned, still taking the downward course. As they progressed many other passageways were crossed, the intersections of which were wide at the open spaces. Occasionally the travelers encountered other natives, all of them men, most of whom turned and followed them. The Big Business Man, after over an hour of this rapid walking downward, was again near the limit of his endurance when the party, after crossing a broad open square, came upon a sort of sleigh with two animals harnessed to it. It was standing at the intersection of a still broader, evidently more traveled passageway, and in it was an attendant, apparently fast asleep. Into this sleigh climbed the three travelers with their guide, Lao, and driven by the attendant, they started down the broader tunnel at a rapid pace. The sleigh was balanced upon a broad single runner of polished stone, with a narrow, slightly shorter outrider on each side. It slid smoothly and easily on this runner over the equally smooth metallic rock of the ground. The reindeer-like animals were harnessed by their heads to a single shaft. They were guided by a short, pointed pole in the hands of the driver, who, as occasion demanded, dug it vigorously into their flanks. In this manner the travelers rode perhaps half an hour more. The passageway sloped steeply downward, and they made good speed. Finally, without warning, except by a sudden freshening of the air, they emerged into the open and found themselves facing a broad, rolling stretch of country, dotted here and there with trees, the country of the ooids at last. For the first time since leaving their own world, the adventurers found themselves amid surroundings that at least held some semblance of an aspect of familiarity. The scene they faced now might have been one of their own land viewed on an abnormally bright though moonless evening. For some miles they could see a rolling, open country curving slightly upward into the dimness of the distance. At their right, close by, lay a broad lake, its surface wrinkled under a gentle breeze and gleaming bright as a great sheet of polished silver. Overhead hung a gray-blue, cloudless sky, studded with a myriad of faint, twinkling, golden silver stars. On the lake shore lay a collection of houses close together at the water's edge and spreading back thinly into the hills behind. This they knew to be Arite, the city of their destination. At the end of the tunnel they left the sleigh, and turning down the gentle sloping hillside, leisurely approached the city. They were part way across an open field, separating them from the nearest houses, when they saw a group of figures coming across the field towards them. This group stopped when still a few hundred yards away, only two of the figures continuing to come forward. They came onward steadily, the tall figure of a man clothed in white, and by his side a slender, graceful boy. In a moment Lao, walking in front of the Doctor and his two companions, stopped suddenly, and turning to face them, said quietly, "The Master." The three travelers, with their hearts pounding, paused an instant. Then, with a shout, the Very Young Man dashed forward, followed by his two companions. "It's Rogers! It's Rogers!" he called, and in a moment more the three men were beside the Chemist, shaking his hand and pouring at him excitedly their words of greeting. The Chemist welcomed them heartily, but with a quiet, curious air of dignity that they did not remember he possessed before. He seemed to have aged considerably since they had last seen him. The lines in his face had deepened, the hair on his temples was white. He seemed also to be rather taller than they remembered him, and certainly he was stouter. He was dressed in a long, flowing robe of white cloth, gathered in at the waist by a girdle from which hung a short sword, apparently of gold or of beaten brass. His legs were bare. On his feet he wore a form of sandal with leather thongs crossing his insteps. His hair grew long over his ears and was cut off at the shoulder line in the fashion of the natives. When the first words of greeting were over, the Chemist turned to the boy, who was standing apart, watching them with big, interested eyes. "My friends," he said quietly, yet with a little underlying note of pride in his voice, "this is my son." The boy approached deferentially. He was apparently about 10 or 11 years of age, tall as his father's shoulder nearly, extremely slight of build, yet with a body perfectly proportioned. He was dressed in a white robe similar to his father's, only shorter, ending at his knees. His skin was of a curious, smooth, milky whiteness, lacking the gray, harder look of that of the native men, and with just a touch of the iridescent quality possessed by the women. His features were cast in a delicate mold, pretty enough almost to be called girlish, yet with a firm squareness of chin distinctly masculine. His eyes were blue, his thick wavy hair, falling to his shoulders, was a chestnut brown. His demeanor was graceful and dignified, yet with a touch of ingenuousness that marked him for the carefree child he really was. He held out his hands, palms up, as he approached. "My name is Loto," he said in a sweet, soft voice with perfect self-possession. "I am glad to meet my father's friends." He spoke English with just a trace of the liquid quality that characterized his mother's tongue. "You are late getting here," remarked the Chemist with a smile, as the three travelers, completely surprised by this sudden introduction, gravely shook hands with the boy. During this time the young Oroid who had guided them down from the forest above the tunnels, had been standing respectfully behind them, a few feet away. A short distance farther on several small groups of natives were gathered, watching the strangers. With a few swift words Loto now dismissed their guide, who bowed low with his hands to his forehead and left them. Led by the Chemist, they continued on down into the city, talking earnestly, telling him the details of this trip. The natives followed them as they moved forward, and as they entered the city others looked at them curiously and, the Very Young Man thought, with a little hostility, yet always from a respectful distance. Evidently it was night, or at least time of sleep at this hour, for the streets they passed through were nearly deserted. End of chapter 18. Of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The City of Aite. The city of Aite, as it looked to them now, was strange beyond anything they had ever seen, but still by no means as extraordinary as they had expected it would be. The streets through which they walked were broad and straight, and were crossed by others at regular intervals of 200 or 300 feet. These streets paralleled each other with mathematical regularity. The city thus was laid out most orderly, but with one peculiarity. The streets did not run in two directions, crossing each other at right angles, but in three, each inclined to an equal degree with the others. The blocks of houses between them, therefore, were cut into diamond-shaped sections and into triangles, never into squares or oblongs. Most of the streets seemed paved with large flat gray blocks of a substance resembling highly polished stone, or a form of opaque glass. There were no sidewalks, but close up before the more pretentious of the houses were small trees growing. The houses themselves were generally triangular or diamond shaped, following the slope of the streets. They were, most of them, but 2 stories in height, with flat roofs, on some of which flowers and trellised vines were growing. They were built principally of the same smooth gray blocks with which the streets were paved. Their windows were large and numerous, without window panes, but closed now, nearly all of them, by shining silvery curtains that looked as though they might have been woven from the metal itself. The doors were of heavy metal, suggesting brass or gold. On some of the houses tiny low-railed balconies hung from the upper windows out over the street. The party proceeded quietly through this now deserted city, crossing a large tree-lined square or park that by the confluence of many streets seemed to mark its center, and turned finally into another diagonal street that dropped swiftly down towards the lake front. At the edge of a promontory this street abruptly terminated in a broad flight of steps leading down to a little beach on the lake shore perhaps 100 feet below. The Chemist turned sharp to the right at the head of these steps, and, passing through the open gateway of an arch in a low gray wall, led his friends into a garden in which were growing a profusion of flowers. These flowers, they noticed, were most of them blue or gray, or of a pale silvery whiteness, lending to the scene a peculiarly wan, wistful appearance, yet one of extraordinary, quiet, unearthly beauty. Through the garden a little gray pebbled path wound back to where a house stood, nearly hidden in a grove of trees upon a bluff directly overlooking the lake. "My home, gentlemen," said the Chemist, with a wave of his hand. As they approached the house they heard, coming from within, the mellow voice of a woman singing, an odd little minor theme with a quaint lilting rhythm and words they could not distinguish. Accompanying the voice or the delicate tones of some stringed instrument suggesting a harp. "We are expected," remarked the Chemist with a smile. "Lylda is still up, waiting for us." The Very Young Man's heart gave a leap at the mention of the name. From the outside the Chemist's house resembled many of the larger ones they had seen as they came through the city. It was considerably more pretentious than any they had yet noticed, diamond shaped, that is to say, a flattened oblong, 2 stories in height and built of large blocks of the gray polished stone. Unlike the other houses, its sides were not bare, but were partly covered by a luxuriant growth of vines and trellised flowers. There were no balconies under its windows, except on the lake side. There, at the height of the 2nd story, a covered balcony broad enough almost to be called a veranda stretched the full width of the house. A broad door of brass fronting the garden stood partly opened, and the Chemist pushed it wide and ushered in his friends. They found themselves now in a triangular hallway or lobby with an open arch in both its other sides, giving a passage into rooms beyond. Through one of these archways the Chemist led them into what evidently was the main living room of the dwelling. It was a high ceilinged room, nearly triangular in shape, 30 feet possibly at its greatest width. In one wall were set several silvery curtained windows opening out onto the lake. On the other side was a broad fireplace and hearth, with another archway beside it leading farther into the house. The walls of the room were lined with small gray tiles. The floor was also tiled with gray and white, set in design. On the floor were spread several large rugs, apparently made of grass or fiber. The walls were bare except between the windows, where 2 long, narrow, heavily embroidered strips of golden cloth were hanging. In the center of the room stood a circular stone table, its top a highly polished black slab of stone. The table was set now for a meal, with golden metal dishes, huge metal goblets of a like color, and beautifully wrought table utensils, also of gold. Around the table were several small chairs made of wicker. In the seat of each lay a padded fiber cushion, and over the back was hung a small piece of embroidered cloth. With the exception of these chairs and table, the room was practically devoid of furniture. Against one wall was a smaller table of stone, with a few miscellaneous objects on its top, and under each window stood a small white stone bench. A fire glowed in the fireplace grate, a fire that burned without flame. On the hearth before it, reclining on a large silvery cushion, was a woman holding in her hands a small stringed instrument like a tiny harp or lyre. When the men entered the room she laid her instrument aside and rose to her feet. As she stood there for an instant expectant, with the light of welcome in her eyes, the 3 strangers beheld what to them seemed the most perfect vision of feminine loveliness they had ever seen. The woman's age at first glance was indeterminate. By her face, her long, slender, yet well-rounded neck, and the slim curves of her girlish figure, she might have been hardly more than 20. Yet in her bearing there was that indefinable poise and dignity that bespoke the more mature, older woman. She was about 5 feet tall, with a slender, almost fragile, yet perfectly rounded body. Her dress consisted of a single flowing garment of light blue silk, reaching from the shoulders to just above her knees. It was girdled at the waist by a thick golden cord that hung with golden tasseled pendants at her side. A narrower golden cord crossed her breast and shoulders. Her arms, legs, and shoulders were bare. Her skin was smooth as satin, milky white, and suffused with the delicate tints of many colors. Her hair was thick and very black. It was twisted into 2 tresses that fell forward over each shoulder nearly to her waist, and ended with a little silver ribbon and tassel tied near the bottom. Her face was a delicate oval. Her lips were full and of a color for which in English there is no name. It would have been red doubtless by sunlight in the world above, but here in this silver light of phosphorescence the color red as we see it was impossible. Her nose was small, of Grecian type. Her slate gray eyes were rather large, very slightly upturned at the corners, giving just a touch of the look of our women of the Orient. Her lashes were long and very black. In conversation she lowered them at times with a charming combination of feminine humility and a touch of coquetry. Her gaze from under them had an often peculiar look of melting softness, yet always it was direct and honest. Such was the woman who quietly stood beside her hearth, waiting to welcome these strange guests from another world. As the men entered through the archway, the boy Loto pushed quickly past them in his eagerness to get ahead, and, rushing across the room, threw himself into the woman's arms, crying happily, "Mita! Mita!" The woman kissed him affectionately. Then, before she had time to speak, the boy pulled her forward, holding her tightly by one hand. "This is my mother," he said, with a pretty little gesture. "Her name is Lylda." The woman loosened herself from his grasp with a smile of amusement, and, native fashion, bowed low with her hands to her forehead. "My husband's friends are welcome," she said simply. Her voice was soft and musical. She spoke English perfectly, with an intonation of which the most cultured woman might be proud, but with a foreign accent much more noticeable than that of her son. "A very long time we have been waiting for you," she added, and then, as an afterthought, she impulsively offered them her hand in their own manner. The Chemist kissed his wife quietly. In spite of the presence of strangers, for a moment she dropped her reserve, her arms went up around his neck, and she clung to him an instant. Gently putting her down, the Chemist turned to his friends. "I think Lylda has supper waiting," he said. Then, as he looked at their torn woolen suits that once were white, and the ragged shoes upon their feet, he added with a smile, "But I think I can make you much more comfortable first." He led them up a broad, curving flight of stone steps to a room above, where they found a shallow pool of water sunk below the level of the floor. Here he left them to bathe, getting them meanwhile robes similar to his own, with which to replace their own soiled garments. In a little while, much refreshed, they descended to the room below, where Lylda had supper ready upon the table waiting for them. "Only a little while ago my father and Aura left," said Lylda, as they sat down to eat. "Lylda's younger sister," the Chemist explained. "She lives with her father here in Arite." The Very Young Man parted his lips to speak, then, with heightened color in his cheeks, he closed them again. They were deftly served at supper by a little native girl who was dressed in a short tunic reaching from waist to knees, with circular discs of gold covering her breasts. There was cooked meat for the meal, a white starchy form of vegetable somewhat resembling a potato, a number of delicious fruits of unfamiliar variety, and for drink the juice of a fruit that tasted more like cider than anything they could name. At the table Loto perched himself beside the Very Young Man, for whom he seemed to have taken a sudden fancy. "I like you," he said suddenly, during a lull in the talk. "I like you too," answered the Very Young Man. "Aura is very beautiful. You'll like her." "I'm sure I will," the Very Young Man agreed soberly. "What's your name?" persisted the boy. "My name's Jack, and I'm glad you like me. I think we're friends, don't you?" And so they became firm friends, and, as far as circumstances would permit, inseparable companions. Lylda presided over the supper with the charming grace of a competent hostess. She spoke seldom, yet when the conversation turned to the great world above, in which her husband was born, She questioned intelligently and with eager interest. Evidently she had a considerable knowledge of the subject, but with an almost childish, insatiable curiosity she sought from her guests more intimate details of the world they lived in. When in lighter vein their talk ran into comments upon the social life of their own world, Lylda's ready wit, combined with her ingenuous simplicity, put to them many questions which made the giving of an understandable answer sometimes amusingly difficult. When the meal was over the three travelers found themselves very sleepy, and all of them were glad when the Chemist suggested that they retire almost immediately. He led them again to the upper story into the bedroom they were to occupy. There, on the low bedsteads, soft with many quilted coverings, they passed the remainder of the time of sleep in dreamless slumber, utterly worn out by their journey, nor guessing what the morning would bring forth. End of chapter 19. The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The World of the Ring. Next morning after breakfast the four men sat upon the balcony overlooking the lake and prepared to hear the Chemist's narrative of what had happened since he left them 5 years before. They had already told him of events in their world, the making of the chemicals and their journey down into the ring, and now they were ready to hear his story. At their ease here upon the balcony, reclining in long wicker chairs of the Chemist's own design, as he proudly admitted, they felt at peace with themselves and the world. Below them lay the shining lake, above spread a clear, star-studded sky. Against their faces blew the cool breath of a gentle summer's breeze. As they sat silent for a moment, enjoying almost with awe the beauties of the scene, and listening to the soft voice of Lylda singing to herself in the garden, the Very Young Man suddenly thought of one thing lacking to make his enjoyment perfect. "I wish I had a cigarette," he remarked wistfully. The Chemist, with a smile, produced cigars of a leaf that proved a very good substitute for tobacco. They lighted them with a tiny metal lighter of the flint and steel variety, filled with a fluffy inflammable wick, a contrivance of the Chemist's own making, and then he started his narrative. "There is much to tell you, my friends," he began thoughtfully, "much that will interest you, shall we say, from a socialistic standpoint. I shall make it brief, for we have no time to sit idly talking. I must tell you now, gentlemen, of what I think you have so far not even had a hint. You have found me living here," he hesitated and smiled, "well, at least, under pleasant and happy circumstances, yet, as a matter of fact, your coming was of vital importance, not only to me and my family, but probably to the future welfare of the entire Oroid nation. We are approaching a crisis here with which I must confess I have felt myself unable to cope. With your help, especially with the power of the chemicals you have brought with you, it may be possible for us to deal successfully with the conditions facing us." "What are they?" asked the Very Young Man eagerly. "Perhaps it would be better for me to tell you chronologically the events as they have occurred. As you remember, when I left you 12 years ago—" "5 years," interrupted the Very Young Man. "5 or 12, as you please," said the Chemist, smiling. "It was my intention then, as you know, to come back to you after a comparatively short stay here." "And bring Mrs.—Lylda with you?" put in the Very Young Man, hesitating in confusion over the Christian name. "And bring Lylda with me," finished the Chemist. "I got back here without much difficulty, and in a very much shorter time, and with less effort than on my first trip. I tried an entirely different method. I stayed as large as possible while descending, and diminished my size materially only after I had reached the bottom." "I told you," said the Big Business Man. "It was a dangerous method of procedure, but I made it successfully without mishap. Lylda and I were married in native fashion shortly after I reached Arite." "How was that? What fashion?" the Very Young Man wanted to know, but the Chemist went on. "It was my intention to stay here only a few weeks and then return with Lylda. She was willing to follow me anywhere I might take her, because well, perhaps you would hardly understand, but women here are different in many ways than you know them. I stayed several months, still planning to leave almost at any time. I found this world an intensely interesting study. Then, when Loto was expected, I again postponed my departure. I had been here over a year before I finally gave up my intention of ever returning to you. I have no close relatives above, you know, no one who cares much for me or for whom I care, and my life seemed thoroughly established here. I'm afraid, gentlemen, I am offering excuses for myself, for my desertion of my own country in the time of its need. I have no defense. As events turned out, I could not have helped probably very much, but still that is no excuse. I can only say that your world up there seemed so very, very far away. Events up there had become to me only vague memories as of a dream. And Lylda and my little son were so near, so real and vital to me. Well, at any rate, I stayed, deciding definitely to make my home and to end my days here." "What did you do about the drugs?" asked the Doctor. "I kept them hidden carefully for nearly a year," the Chemist replied. "Then, fearing lest they should in some way get loose, I destroyed them. They possess a diabolical power, gentlemen. I'm afraid of it." "They called you the Master," suggested the Very Young Man after a pause. "Why was that?" The Chemist smiled. "They do call me the Master. That has been for several years. I suppose I am the most important individual in the nation today." "I should think you would be," said the Very Young Man quickly. "What you did, and with the knowledge you have." The Chemist went on. "Lylda and I lived with her father and Aura. Her mother is dead, you know, until after Loto was born. Then we had a house further up in the city. Later, about 8 years ago, I built this house we now occupy, and Lylda laid out its garden, which she is tremendously proud of, and which I think is the finest in Arite. Because of what I had done in the Malite War, I became naturally the king's adviser. Everyone felt me the savior of the nation, which, in a way, I suppose I was. I never used the drugs again, and as only a very few of the people ever understood them, or in fact ever knew of them or believed in their existence, my extraordinary change in stature was ascribed to some supernatural power. I have always since been credited with being able to exert that power at will, although I never used it but that once." "You have it again now," said the Doctor, smiling. "Yes, I have, thank God," answered the Chemist fervently, "though I hope I shall never have to use it." "Aren't you planning to go back with us?" asked the Very Young Man. "Even for a visit?" The Chemist shook his head. "My way lies here," he said quietly, yet with deep feeling. A silence followed. Finally the Chemist roused himself from his reverie, and went on. "Although I never again changed my stature, there were 1,000 different ways in which I continued to make myself, well, famous throughout the land. I have taught these people many things, gentlemen, like this, for instance." He indicated his cigar and the chair in which he was sitting. "You cannot imagine what a variety of things one knows beyond the knowledge of so primitive a race as this. And so gradually I became known as the Master. I have no official position, but everywhere I am known by that name. As a matter of fact, for the past year at least, it has been rather too descriptive a title." The Chemist smiled somewhat ruefully. "For I have had in reality, and have now, the destiny of the country on my shoulders." "You are not threatened with another war?" asked the Very Young Man. "No, not exactly that. But I had better go on with my story first. This is a very different world now, gentlemen, from that I first entered 12 years ago. I think first I should tell you about it as it was then." His three friends nodded their agreement, and the Chemist continued. "I must make it clear to you, gentlemen, that one great fundamental difference between this world and yours. In the evolution of this race there has been no cause for strife. The survival of the fittest always has been an unknown doctrine, a non existent problem. In extent, this inner surface upon which we are now living is nearly as great as the surface of your own earth. From the earliest known times it has been endowed with a perfect climate, a climate such as you are now enjoying." The Very Young Man expanded his chest and looked his appreciation. "The climate, the rainfall, everything is ideal for crops and for living conditions. In the matter of food, one needs in fact do practically nothing. Fruits of a variety ample to sustain life grow wild in abundance. Vegetables planted are harvested seemingly without blight or hazard of any kind. No destructive insects have ever impeded agriculture. No wild animals have ever existed to harass humanity. Nature, in fact, offers every help and no obstacle towards making a simple, primitive life easy to live. Under such conditions, the race developed only so far as was necessary to ensure a healthful, pleasant existence. Civilization here is what you would call primitive. Wants are few and easily supplied, too easily probably, for without strife these people have become, well, shall I say effeminate? They are not exactly that. It is not a good word." "I should think that such an unchanging, unrigorous climate would make a race deteriorate in physique rapidly," observed the Doctor. "How about disease down here?" asked the Big Business Man. "It's a curious thing," replied the Chemist. "Cleanliness seems to be a trait inborn with every individual in this race. It is more than godliness. It is the one great cardinal virtue. You must have noticed it, just in coming through Arite. Personal cleanliness of the people, and cleanliness of houses, streets, of everything. It is truly extraordinary to what extent they go to make everything inordinately, immaculately clean. Possibly for that reason, and because there never seems to have been any serious disease germs existing here, sickness as you know it does not exist." "Guess you'd better not go into business here," said the Very Young Man with a grin at the Doctor. "There is practically no illness worthy of the name," went on the Chemist. "The people live out their lives, and, barring accident, die peacefully of old age." "How old do they live to be?" asked the Big Business Man. "About the same as with you," answered the Chemist, "only, of course, as we measure time." "Say, how about that?" the Very Young Man asked. "My watch is still going. Is it ticking out the old time or the new time down here?" "I should say probably, certainly, it was giving time of your own world, just as it always did," the Chemist replied. "Well, there's no way of telling, is there?" said the Big Business Man. "What is the exact difference in time?" the Doctor asked. "That is something I have no means of determining. It was rather a curious thing when I left that letter for you." The Chemist turned to the Doctor. "It never occurred to me that although I had told you to start down here on a certain day, I would be quite at a loss to calculate when that day had arrived. It was my estimation after my first trip here that time in this world passed at a rate of about 2 2/5 times faster than it does in your world. That is as near as I ever came to it. We can calculate it more closely now, since we have only the interval of your journey down as an indeterminate quantity." "How near right did you hit it? When did you expect us?" asked the Doctor. "About 30 days ago. I have been waiting since then. I sent nearly 100 men through the tunnels into the forest to guide you in." "You taught them pretty good English," said the Very Young Man. "They were tickled to death that they knew it, too," he added, with a reminiscent grin. "You say about 30 days. How do you measure time down here?" asked the Big Business Man. "I call a day one complete cycle of sleeping and eating," the Chemist replied. "I suppose that is the best translation of the Oroid word. We have a word that means about the same thing." "How long is a day?" inquired the Very Young Man. "It seems in the living about the same as your 24 hours. It occupies probably about the interval of time of 10 hours in your world." "You see," the Chemist went on, "we ordinarily eat twice between each time of sleep, once after rising and once a few hours before bedtime. Workers at severe muscular labor sometimes eat a light meal in between, but the custom is not general. Time is generally spoken of as so many meals rather than days." "But what is the arbitrary standard?" asked the Doctor. "Do you have an equivalent for weeks or months or years?" "Yes," answered the Chemist, "based on astronomy, the same as in your world. But I would rather not explain that now. I want to take you later to day to see Lylda's father. You will like him. He is, well, what we might call a scientist. He talks English fairly well. We can discuss astronomy with him. You will find him very interesting." "How can you tell time?" the Very Young Man wanted to know. "There is no sun to go by. You have no clocks, have you?" "There is one downstairs," answered the Chemist, "but you didn't notice it. Lylda's father has a very fine one. He will show it to you." "It seems to me," began the Doctor thoughtfully after a pause, reverting to their previous topic, "that without sickness, under such ideal living conditions as you say exist here, in a very short time this world would be overpopulated." "Nature seems to have taken care of that," the Chemist answered. "And as a matter of fact, quite the reverse is true. Women mature in life at an age you would call about 16. But early marriages are not the rule. Seldom is a woman married before she is 20. Frequently she is much older. Her period of childbearing, too, is comparatively short, frequently less than 10 years. The result is few children, whose rate of mortality is exceedingly low." "How about the marriages?" the Very Young Man suggested. "You were going to tell us." "Marriages are by mutual consent," answered the Chemist, "solemnized by a simple social ceremony. They are for a stated period of time, and are renewed later if both parties desire. When a marriage is dissolved, children are cared for by the mother generally, and her maintenance, if necessary, is provided for by the government. The state becomes the guardian also of all illegitimate children and children of unknown parentage. But of both these latter classes there are very few. They work for the government, as do many other people, until they are of age, when they become free to act as they please." "You spoke about women being different than we know them. How are they different?" the Very Young Man asked. "If they're all like Lylda, I think they're great," he added enthusiastically, flushing a little at his own temerity. The Chemist smiled his acknowledgment of the compliment. "The status of women and their character is, I think, one of the most remarkable things about this race. You will remember when I returned from here the first time that I was much impressed by the kindliness of these people. Because of their history and their government, they seem to have become imbued with the milk of human kindness to a degree approaching the utopian. Crime here is practically non existent. There is nothing over which contention can arise. What crimes are committed are punished with a severity seeming out of all proportion to what you would call justice. A persistent offender, even of fairly trivial wrongdoing, is put to death without compunction. There is no imprisonment except for those awaiting trial. Punishment is a reprimand with the threat of death if the offense is committed again, or death itself immediately. Probably this very severity and the swiftness with which punishment is meted out to a large extent discourages wrongdoing. But fundamentally the capacity for doing wrong is lacking in these people. I have said practically nothing exists over which contention can arise. That is not strictly true. No race of people can develop without some individual contention over the possession of their women. The passions of love, hate, and jealousy, centering around sex and its problems, are as necessarily present in human beings as life itself. Love here is deep, strong, and generally lasting. It lacks fire, intensity, perhaps. I should say it is rather of a placid quality. Hatred seldom exists. Jealousy is rare, because both sexes in their actions towards the other are guided by a spirit of honesty and fairness that is really extraordinary. This is true particularly of the women. They are absolutely honest, square, through and through. Crimes against women are few, yet in general they are the most prevalent type we have. They are punishable by death, even those that you would characterize as comparatively slight offenses. It is significant, too, that in judging these crimes but little evidence is required. A slight chain of proven circumstances and the word of the woman is all that is required. This, you will say, places a tremendous power in the hands of women. It does, yet they realize it thoroughly and justify it, although they know that almost at their word a man will be put to death. Practically never, I am convinced, is this power abused. With extreme infrequency a female is proven guilty of lying. The penalty is death, for there is no place here for such a woman. The result is that women are accorded a freedom of movement far beyond anything possible in your world. They are safe from harm. Their morals are, according to the standard here, practically 100% perfect. With short-term marriages dissolvable at will, there is no reason why they should be otherwise. Curiously enough, too, marriages are renewed frequently. More than that, I should say generally, for lifelong periods. Polygamy, with the consent of all parties, is permitted, but seldom practiced. Polyandry is unlawful, and but few cases of it ever appear. You may think all this a curious system, gentlemen, but it works. That's the answer, muttered the Very Young Man. It was obvious he was still thinking of Lylda and her sister with a heightened admiration and respect. End of chapter 20. #21 of The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Life Worth Living. The appearance of Lylda at one of the long windows of the balcony interrupted the men for a moment. She was dressed in a tunic of silver, of curious texture, like flexible woven metal, reaching to her knees. On her feet were little fiber sandals. Her hair was twisted in coils, piled upon her head, with a knot low at the back of the neck. From her head, in graceful folds, hung a thin scarf of gold. She stood waiting in the window a moment for them to notice her. Then she said quietly, "I am going for a time to the court." She hesitated an instant over the words. The Chemist inclined his head in agreement, and with a smile at her guests and a little bow she withdrew. The visitors looked inquiringly at their host. "I must tell you about our government," said the Chemist. "Lylda plays quite an important part in it." He smiled at their obvious surprise. "The head of the government is the king. In reality he is more like the president of a republic. He is chosen by the people to serve for a period of about 20 years. The present king is now in, well, let us say about the 15th year of his service. This translation of time periods into English is confusing," he interjected. somewhat apologetically. "We shall see the king tomorrow. You will find him a most intelligent, likable man. As a sort of congress, the king has 150 advisors, half of them women, who meet about once a month. Lylda is one of these women. He also has an inner circle of closer, more intimate counselors, consisting of 4 men and 4 women. One of these women is the queen. Another is Lylda. I am one of the men. The capital of the nation is Arite. Each of the other cities governs itself in so far as its own local problems are concerned, according to a somewhat similar system, but all are under the central control of the Arite government." "How about the country in between, the rural population?" asked the Big Business Man. "It is all apportioned off to the nearest city," answered the Chemist. "Each city controls a certain amount of the land around it. This Congress of 150 is the law-making body. The judiciary is composed of 1 court in each city. There is a leader of the court, or judge, and a jury of 40, 20 men and 20 women. The juries are chosen for continuous service for a period of 5 years. Lylda is at present serving in the Arite court. They meet very infrequently and irregularly, called as occasion demands. A 2/3 vote is necessary for decision. There is no appeal." "Are there lawyers?" asked the Big Business Man. "There is no one who makes that his profession, no. Generally the accused talks for himself, or has some relative or possibly some friend to plead his case." "You have police?" the Doctor asked. "A very efficient police force, both for the cities and in the country. Really, they are more like detectives than police. They are the men I sent up into the forest to meet you. We also have an army, which at present consists almost entirely of this same police force. After the Malite War it was of course very much larger, but of late years it has been disbanded almost completely." "How about the money?" the Very Young Man wanted to know. "There is none," answered the Chemist with a smile. "Great Scott! How can you manage that?" ejaculated the Big Business Man. "Our industrial system undoubtedly is peculiar," the Chemist replied, "but I can only say again it works. We have no money, and so far none apparently is needed. Everything is bought and sold as an exchange. For instance, suppose I wish to make a living as a farmer. I have my land." "How did you get it?" interrupted the Very Young Man quickly. "All the land is divided up pro rata and given by each city to its citizens. At the death of its owner it reverts to the government, and each citizen coming of age receives his share from the surplus always remaining." "What about women? Can they own land too?" asked the Very Young Man. "They have identical rights with men in everything," the Chemist answered. "But women surely cannot cultivate their own land," the Doctor said. Evidently he was thinking of Lylda's fragile little body, and certainly if most of the Oroid women were like her, labor in the fields would be for them quite impossible. A few women by choice do some of the lighter forms of manual labor, but they are very few. Nearly every woman marries within a few years after she receives her land. If it is to be cultivated, her husband then takes charge of it." "Is the cultivation of land compulsory?" asked the Big Business Man. "Only when in a city's district a shortage of food is threatened. Then the government decides the amount and kind of food needed, and the citizens, drawn by lot, are ordered to produce it. The government watches very carefully its food supply. In case of overproduction, certain citizens, those less skillful, are ordered to work at something else. This supervision over supply and demand is exercised by the government not only in the question of food, but in manufactures, in fact, in all industrial activities. A very nice balance is obtained, so that practically no unnecessary work is done throughout the nation. And, gentlemen, do you know, as a matter of fact, I think That is the secret of a race of people being able to live without having to work most of its waking hours. If your civilization could eliminate all its unnecessary work, there would be far less work to do." "I wonder, isn't this balance of supply and demand very difficult to maintain?" asked the Big Business Man thoughtfully. "Not nearly so difficult as you would think," the Chemist answered. "In the case of land cultivation, the government has a large reserve, the cultivation of which it adjusts to maintain this balance. Thus, in some districts the citizens do as they please and are never interfered with. The same is true of manufacturers. There is no organized business in the nation, not even so much as the smallest factory, except that conducted by the government. Each city has its own factories, whose production is carefully planned exactly to equal the demand." "Suppose a woman marries, and her land is far away from her husband's. That would be sort of awkward, wouldn't it?" suggested the Very Young Man. "Each year at a stated time," the Chemist answered, "transfers of land are made. There are generally enough people who want to move to make satisfactory changes of location practical. And then, of course, the government always stands ready to take up any two widely separate pieces of land and give others in exchange out of its reserve." "Suppose you don't like the new land as well?" objected the Very Young Man. "Almost all land is of equal value," answered the Chemist, "and of course its state of cultivation is always considered." "You were speaking about not having money," prompted the Very Young Man. "The idea is simply this. Suppose I wish to cultivate nothing except, let us say, certain vegetables. I register with the government my intention and the extent to which I propose to go. I receive the government's consent. I then take my crops as I harvest them and exchange them for every other article I need." "With whom do you exchange them?" asked the Doctor. "Any one I please, or with the government. 90% of everything produced is turned into the government, and other articles are taken from its stores." "How is the rate of exchange established?" asked the Big Business Man. "It is computed by the government. Private exchanges are supposed to be made at the same rate. It is against the law to cut under the government rate, but it is done, although apparently not with sufficient frequency to cause any trouble." "I should think it would be tremendously complicated and annoying to make all these exchanges," observed the Big Business Man. "Not at all," answered the Chemist, "because of the governmental system of credits. The financial standing of every individual is carefully kept on record." "Without any money? I don't get you," said the Very Young Man, with a frown of bewilderment. The Chemist smiled. "Well, I don't blame you for that, but I think I can make myself clear. Let us take the case of Loto, for instance, as an individual. When he comes of age he will be allotted his section of land. We will assume him to be without family at the time, entirely dependent on his own resources." "Would he never have worked before coming of age?" the Very Young Man asked. "Children with parents generally devote their entire minority to getting an education and to building their bodies properly. Without parents they are supported by the government and live in public homes. Such children, during their adolescence, work for the government a small portion of their time. Now, when Loto comes of age and gets his land, located approximately where he desires it, he will make his choice as to his vocation. Suppose he wishes not to cultivate his land, but to work for the government. He is given some congenial, suitable employment at which he works approximately 5 hours a day. No matter what he elects to do at the time he comes of age, the government opens an account with him. He is credited with a certain standard unit for his work, which he takes from the government in supplies at his own convenience." "What is the unit?" asked the Big Business Man. "It is the average work produced by the average worker in one day, purely an arbitrary figure." "Like our word horsepower?" put in the Doctor. "Exactly. All merchandise, food, and labor is valued in terms of it. Thus, you see, every individual has his financial standing, all in relation to the government. He can let his balance pile up if he is able, or he can keep it low. "Suppose he goes into debt," suggested the Very Young Man. "In the case of obvious, verified necessity, the government will allow him a limited credit. Persistent, shall I say willful debt is a crime." "I thought at first," said the Big Business Man, "that everybody in this nation was on the same financial footing, that there was no premium put upon skill or industriousness. Now I see that one can accumulate, if not money, at least an inordinate amount of the world's goods." "Not such an inordinate amount," said the Chemist, smiling, "because there is no inheritance. A man and woman, combining their worldly wealth, may by industry acquire more than others, but they are welcome to enjoy it. And they cannot in one lifetime get a preponderance of wealth as to cause much envy from those lacking it." "What happens to this house when you and Lylda die if Loto cannot have it?" the Big Business Man asked. "It is kept in repair by the government and held until someone with a sufficiently large balance wants to buy it." "Are all workers paid at the same rate?" asked the Doctor. "No, but their wages are much nearer equal than in your world." "You have to hire people to work for you. How do you pay them?" the Doctor inquired. "The rate is determined by governmental standard. I pay them by having the amount deducted from my balance and added to theirs." "When you built this house, how did you go about doing it?" asked the Big Business Man. "I simply went to the government, and they built it for me according to my own ideas and wishes, deducting its cost from my balance." "What about the public work to be done?" asked the Big Business Man. "Caring for the city streets, the making of roads, and all that. Do you have taxes?" "No," answered the Chemist, smiling. "We do not have taxes. Quite the reverse. We sometimes have dividends. The government, you must understand, not only conducts a business account with each of its citizens, but one with itself also. The value of articles produced is computed with a profit allowance, so that by a successful business administration the government is enabled not only to meet its public obligations, but to acquire a surplus to its own credit in the form of accumulated merchandise. This surplus is divided among the people every 5 years, a sort of dividend." "I should think some cities might have much more than others," said the Big Business Man. "That would cause discontent, wouldn't it?" "It would probably cause a rush of people to the more successful cities. But it doesn't happen, because each city reports to the national government, and the whole thing is averaged up. You see, it is all quite simple," the Chemist finished, "and it makes life here very easy to live, and very worth the living." Unnoticed by the 4 interested men, a small, compact looking gray cloud had come sweeping down from the horizon above the lake and was scudding across the sky toward Arite. A sudden sharp crack of thunder interrupted their conversation. "Hello, a storm!" exclaimed the Chemist, looking out over the lake. "You've never seen one, have you? Come upstairs." They followed him into the house and upstairs to its flat roof. From this point of vantage they saw that the house was built with an interior courtyard or patio. Looking down into this courtyard from the roof, they could see a little splashing fountain in its center, with flower beds, a narrow gray path, and several small white benches. The roof, which was guarded with a breast-high parapet around both its inner and outer edges, was beautifully laid out with a variety of flowers and with trellised flower-bearing vines. In one corner were growing a number of small trees with great fan-shaped leaves of blue and bearing a large bell-shaped silver blossom. One end of the roof on the lakeside was partially enclosed. Towards this roof enclosure the Chemist led his friends. Within it a large fiber hammock hung between two stone posts. At one side, a depression in the floor perhaps 8 feet square was filled with what might have been blue pine needles and a fluffy bluish moss. This rustic couch was covered at one end by a canopy of vines bearing a little white flower. As they entered the enclosure it began to rain, and the Chemist slid forward several panels, closing them in completely. There were shuttered windows in these walls through which they could look at the scene outside, a scene that with the coming storm was weird and beautiful beyond anything they had ever beheld. The cloud had spread sufficiently now to blot out the stars from nearly half of the sky. It was a thick cloud, absolutely opaque, and yet it caused no appreciable darkness, for the starlight it cut off was negligible, and the silver radiation from the lake had more than doubled in intensity. Under the strong wind that had sprung up the lake assumed now an extraordinary aspect. Its surface was raised into long, sweeping waves that curved sharply and broke upon themselves. In their tops the silver phosphorescence glowed and whirled until the whole surface of the lake seemed filled with a dancing white fire, twisting, turning, and seeming to leap out of the water high into the air. Several small sailboats, square, flat little catamarans they looked, showed black against the water as they scudded for shore, trailing lines of silver out behind them. The wind increased in force. Below on the beach a huge rock lay in the water, against which the surf was breaking. Columns of water at times shot into the air before the face of the rock and were blown away by the wind in great clouds of glistening silver. Occasionally it thundered with a very sharp intense crack, accompanied by a jagged bolt of bluish lightning that zigzagged down from the low-hanging cloud. Then came the rain in earnest, a solid, heavy torrent that bent down the wind and smoothed the surface of the lake. The rain fell almost vertically, as though it were a tremendous curtain of silver strings. And each of these strings broke apart into great shining pearls as the eye followed downward the course of the raindrops. For perhaps 10 minutes the silver torrent poured down, then suddenly it ceased. The wind had died away. In the air there was the fresh, warm smell of wet and steaming earth. From the lake rolled up a shimmering, translucent cloud of mist, like an enormous silver fire mounting into the sky. And then, as the gray clouds swept back behind them, beyond the city the stars gleamed overhead. They saw again that great trail of stardust which the Chemist first had seen through his microscope, hanging in an ever-broadening arc across the sky and ending vaguely at their feet. End of chapter 21.